Hello, in this video I want to share a thesis that I read in a book by Henry Kissinger called The World Order. On the surface, this thesis might appear bizarre, but the more I looked into it, the more it actually made sense. So Henry Kissinger essentially argues that Putin's foreign policy today is still shaped by the Mongol invasion. Okay, so let us look at Russian history. And then we can conclude whether or not this thesis makes sense. So Henry Kissinger starts with an observation. From the 13th up until the late 15th century, Russia is faced with an enemy, the Mongol Empire. And the Mongols are truly convinced that they are destined to control the entire world. They are faced with a very brutal enemy, an enemy that has no problem annihilating all the cities and states and tribes that refuse to get conquered by them. And Henry Kissinger argues that the Russian emperors and the Russian people were so traumatized by this experience of the Mongol conquest that at that time, so when they finally fought off the Mongols in the late 15th century, they concluded that the Russian Empire needs to expand to the furthest possible point before they reach another military alliance of equal strength or stronger than Russia. And Kissinger argues that Russian foreign policy really hasn't changed since the medieval times in that aspect. Now, he also recognizes that at that time, the early modern era and the medieval time, all other great powers had pretty much the same ideology. Like, we are going to expand until we can. Like, the Crusaders were somewhat limited because they just wanted to conquer the Holy Land, but the Eastern Roman Empire, for example, in their wars with Persia, tried to take as much territory as possible. In that process, the Eastern Roman Empire was greatly weakened and then conquered by the Arabs. Now, the Muslim Arabs and the Mongols are probably the most extreme and the most successful versions of this ideology, that they are destined to control the world. The Eastern Roman Empire believed that they are destined to create the Roman Empire again, but they would always fail for some reason, primarily because they would either get attacked by Arabs or by the Bulgarian Khaganate that used to be pretty strong. China, although often isolationist, also had times of just spreading until they reached the furthest possible point, like under the Qin dynasty. They conquered Taiwan and many other areas and islands. So yeah, there's nothing that weird about having that ideology back in the 15th, 16th century. But then Kissinger argues, in Europe, something changes in the 17th century. The 30 Years' War happens, one of the most brutal wars in history. The German Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire as we call it, it loses 40% of its people in this brutal war between Catholics and Protestants. And many other countries get annihilated, and like diseases spread. There is massive famine across Europe, and European powers, out of necessity, according to Henry Kissinger, decide, okay, we need to have some kind of international order, although they view just Europe as a place that's civilized enough to accept it. So the European powers agree, okay, we can still have wars, but let's limit them. Let's stop this total war. Let's not have the wars that are this destructive. Let's not try to completely wipe off each other from the map. And with some important exceptions, most European powers accept that ideology in the 17th century, after the end of the 30 Years' War. The Westphalian world order is then established. And okay, what are the exceptions? For example, the partition of Poland, what Napoleon did, what Louis XIV tried. But yeah, generally European powers then agree, okay, let's not completely wipe off the map other European countries. And okay, the reason why this principle is generally upheld, Kissinger also argues, as do many other historians, is that the British Empire, the strongest navy in the world, decided to defend this world order. At first it was the European order. Why do the British defend it? Not so much out of kindness of their hearts, but simply it is not in the British interest to allow one country to claim the entirety of Europe. Then that country would be strong enough to develop a navy of its own and take over the British Empire. And Kissinger argues that's why the British fought against Napoleon, and that's why they fought against Hitler. It was in their self-interest. But nonetheless, out of self-interest, something good was created. A world order that essentially, Kissinger argues, between the end of the 30 Years' War and World War I, really managed to prevent European countries from waging total wars of annihilation on each other. And even World War I was a war that started essentially as a war that was supposed to be limited, and then it escalated into a total war of destruction that nobody wanted. So Kissinger argues that between the 30 Years' War and actually Hitler, no European power tried to completely dominate Europe. Now, the Ottoman Empire was not a part of this agreement, since they were Muslim and they still believed in the mission that Muhammad gave them to conquer the world. But yeah, the only major exception to this rule was actually Napoleon. Why did Napoleon feel like he has the right to break this very important rule, and that is that one country cannot dominate the entirety of Europe? Well, Napoleon was spreading a new ideology, French Revolution, that is. He was liberating Jews from the ghettos, giving, abolishing feudalism. And yeah, that's why he felt he is entitled to now spread the revolution in a similar way in which Stalin felt that he was entitled to, after the fall of fascism, to spread the communist revolution. But okay, that Stalin also made some other arguments that sound much more like something that a Russian emperor would say. But yeah, Kissinger argues, so up until Hitler, with the exception of Napoleon, European countries generally accept this idea that in order to be a part of the European civilization, you are not supposed to break the balance of power in Europe. Now, we are also going to talk about why the German Empire ended up doing that. But yeah, Napoleon actually suffers the same fate that Hitler does. He is defeated in Russia, and he is defeated by the British Navy on the seas. And what happens then? So with the French army being annihilated, suddenly Russia is the main land power in Europe, and the Russian emperors, they have the opportunity to claim Central and Eastern Europe for themselves. Russian Emperor Aleksandar III, he actually does something that was very worrying at the time for all European rurals. He orders 150,000 of his men to march around Paris. And the message was very, very clear. What he was saying to other European states at the time was, look at my army, I can conquer you if I want. And many European intellectuals and philosophers at the time, they freak out, and many of them say now Russia is just going to take over Europe. But that doesn't happen. So why not? Because the Russian emperors at the time, Kissinger argues, were too worried that a revolution might break out on their own soil. So that's why they didn't want to wage huge wars against other Christian European nations, because they were afraid that if they get bogged down in a destructive war, that revolution will start somewhere in Europe and then spread to their own soil. And in a way they were right. That happened in World War I, although it started on their soil, which is not what many people expected, the revolution to start in the most backwards country in Europe. But so something interesting also happens. So the Russian emperors, they do not want to like attack other European countries, at least not like to the extent that would force them to have a huge war. So they decide to attack the so after crushing the revolution of 1848, in which the Russian military, together with the Croatian general Ban Jelačić, they saved the Habsburg monarchy from revolution. After that, the Russian Empire decides to attack the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War. But something remarkable happens. Britain and France, two countries that kind of hated each other because Napoleon attacked Britain, they make an alliance with a Muslim country, the Ottoman Empire, against Russia, a Christian country that not so long ago helped Britain against France. Why do they do that? Because they really want to preserve the balance of power in Europe. And something interesting also happens. The Habsburg monarchy, that was just saved by the Russians, proclaims neutrality in the Crimean War, and the Russian emperors, they see that as an insult to their honor, which is why they end up backing Serbia against the Habsburg monarchy later. And because they do that, Habsburg monarchy is pushed into alliance with Germany, a very crazy and imperialist country at the beginning of the 20th century. And yeah, Henry Kissinger argues actually, in a way, the Crimean War created the perfect conditions for World War I. Without the Crimean War, without the Habsburg neutrality in that war, Germany would lack allies in Europe and would maybe behave more moderately, and Serbia would also lack allies in Europe, like the mighty Russian Empire, and they would behave more moderately. But yeah, as we know, history gave us what it gave us, and we got World War I. But okay, before World War I started, Germany was unified by Bismarck, a political genius that, despite destroying the balance of power in Europe, still didn't want Germany to act too aggressively. Bismarck was smart enough not to want World War I to happen, but after he died, Kaiser Wilhelm, he just felt too confident in the might of the German military and really was not afraid of escalating too much, and that is also what plunged Europe into this total war of destruction. And yeah, out of that anger, then we have Hitler emerging and completely disrespecting all notions of European civilization, like the balance of power. Now, but okay, Kissinger then argues, like why did the Russian military establishment, why did they never accept this European notion of not not trying to establish a, let's say, a dominance in Europe, of not trying to completely conquer your neighbors up to the point where you reach the enemy alliance of equal strength? Well, because unlike the European nations that fought in the 30 Years' War, Russia never fought in that war, and Russia was actually never helped by European liberal institutions, like by the British Empire, for example, that guaranteed the freedom of Belgium, of Netherlands against the Spanish Empire. So the Russian people, they don't really have a collective memory of ever being saved by the international world order. Nobody saved them from the Mongols really, and from Hitler they also mostly ended up saving themselves. But many European countries, like the Netherlands, like Belgium, actually have a memory of European institutions saving them from other imperialist powers. And okay, a question I want to ask at the end is Kissinger really objective? Like, is it really true that Russian foreign policy never really changed from the times of the Russian emperors, like Ivan the Terrible, up to Vladimir Putin? Isn't that maybe a bit discriminatory or too essentialist, too simplified way of looking at history? Is it maybe that Kissinger was anti-Russian because after all he was a Cold War politician? Well, okay, obviously Kissinger is pro-liberalism and anti-Russia, but he still is one of the best historians I read, and he wouldn't be able, for example, to make peace with China without being able to understand how civilizations work and how geopolitics work. And he also gives an explanation for why American imperialism is more moderate than Russian imperialism, and that explanation has nothing to do with like American values being better or America being more free, nothing like that. He gives a very simple geographical explanation. America, the United States of America, they are surrounded by ocean. Their neighbors, unlike the Russian neighbors that were often very crazy and aggressive, like Hitler's Germany or Japan or Maoist China, that also attacked them, America had neighbors much weaker than them and often friendly, like Canada, or neutral, like Mexico. And that's why the United States didn't really feel like they need to acquire land for security. They never felt really threatened by their neighbors, and even in the 19th century, annexing territory becomes a taboo for the American people. At least, if we are not talking about Indians that were like seen as savages and not worthy of European civilizational norms. But in their war with Mexico, the United States actually does not simply take their land away from them, they force them to sell them. California, Arizona, and some other territories. So Kissinger argues for America what is in their interest, to have a huge navy, a very powerful navy, and to spread the ideology of free market capitalism around the world in order to then be able to sell their goods on various different markets. But in the mind of the Russian military elites, what is in their best interest? It is to create a series of vassal states around the Russian Empire in order to protect Russia against the likes of Genghis Khan or Hitler. And although Stalin had like other justifications, like we are spreading communism, we are helping the workers of Poland and Czechoslovakia, his real intention was actually the same that the Russian emperors of medieval times had, and that is just to establish a series of vassal states around the Russian Empire in order to protect them against possible invasion, because in the mind of the Russian emperor, you can only trust yourself for protection and your own allies, not the international institutions that in their minds never work and are actually even often biased against them and just are too flawed to trust. And then what happens when vassal states decide to not be your vassal states again? Well, then Russian emperors, historically speaking, then they attack. Blood and soil tactics. They conquer you if you don't want to be their vassal. And I actually think that Kissinger, despite being a Cold War politician, was very objective in his view of Russia, and I mostly agree with it. Yeah, I do think that it sometimes even makes sense to go that far back in the past in order to explain a mentality of a certain country. Okay, don't forget to drop like, share and sub if you liked this video.